Hey folks, thank you so much for coming to my talk. Quite excited I'm quite excited to do this talk again. I did this talk as a keynote, and I'm doing it as an international track. So now I'll be able to answer most of your questions, and let's get started. So if you're not available for the keynote, I'll just go over my slides again and talk about stuff that's happening in Africa in the open source space. So let me share my slides. Yeah, perfect. So once again, welcome everybody. The title of this talk is Open Source in Africa. The background image right here is from the Open Source Festival, the first Open Source Festival we had here in Africa, specifically in Lagos, Nigeria, where we had people from all over Africa and even people from London and the US come for the Open Source Festival. It was organized by Open Source Community Africa, I think the biggest open source community here in Africa. I'm going to talk about the community very soon as we go further. So this particular meetup happened in summit happened in February, and I was also part of the organizing team. So let's get into the talk. So like I said, my name is Shedrack. I'm a software developer. I'm a developer advocate at Foundry Foundation. We're an open source platform as a service. We provide one of the best developer experience on Kubernetes. And I'm also a technical writer. I write during my free time for LogRocket, on my personal blog, and Smashing Magazine. So Africa, let's talk about Africa. We all know Africa, right? Africa is one of the most populous Black continents in the world. It's basically a continent with various countries in it, like my home country, Nigeria, is based in Africa. We have various countries, Ghana, Namibia, etc. Africa is quite populated, like I said, one of the most populous Black continents in the world, and the only Black continent in the world. Africa is populated by about 1.216 billion people. That's about 2016. This should be about 1.5 billion now in 2020. Currently, so the way they painted Africa is Africa has crude oil, Africa has mineral resources, etc. But currently, as of 2020, Africa's major resource is talent. We have various talented designers, developers, engineers across the world working for different companies in Silicon Valley, in Canada, etc. So we have a lot of Africans working for any of the Fortune 500 companies, Google, Shopify, etc. Now let's take a look at the GitHub state of the October 2019. I mean, most of us here, when you're in open source, most of the open source code we have is hosted on GitHub. So in the GitHub state of the October 2019 report, it shows that a couple of places have increased over the course of 2019, and the highest growth they've seen in the increase is Nigeria, with 59% growth as at last year, as of 2018, which is a large number of growth. We've seen contributions from Kenya, which is also an African country, about 44%, Tunisia, Morocco. This shows. So digging in, basically, these particular countries here are one of the highest countries with the highest growth and contributions into open source. So Africa is becoming a very global community for developers contributing in open source. And we as Open Source Community Africa, we are trying to make this even much more bigger, as that by the time the 2020 report is out. You can get this report by going to october.github.com. The next thing we should see is the regional spotlight, so Africa. So code and creativity are obviously in no short supply in Africa. Like I said, Africa's major resource is the talented individuals that we have here in Africa. Developers here created 40% more open source repository in 2019 than 2018, which is a higher percentage growth than any other continent in the world. This is a very, very big growth for us. So we saw about 65% increase in Morocco, Kenya about 54%, Nigeria we saw 50%, Egypt we saw 49%, and South Africa we saw 40%, which is a lot of growth coming from Africa. Larger developer communities like those in Morocco, Kenya, we saw about 70% more in growth in contributors in 2019 than in 2020. And just imagine how the numbers would be like in 2020 or 2021. So let's talk about Oscar now. Open Source Community Africa, like I said, is the biggest open source community here in Africa, where we are creating a community of creatives that are driving the open source movement in Africa. It was created basically to encourage more African developers to contribute to open source projects and advocate for open source movements in Africa. Its main goal basically is to ensure that Africans not only use the software and hardware created by other continents, but also create these technologies, these open source technologies that a lot of us are using, or a lot of people across the world are using. Now, OSCA is currently situated in about 5 countries, looking forward to crossing the whole of Africa in the coming years. We have people in Ethiopia, we have countries in communities in Kenya, we have communities in Nigeria, we have in Sierra Leone, we have in Zimbabwe. This is where our marks are we've currently reached. We are looking forward to reaching the entire Africa. We have currently in 11 cities and we have 1,000+ members. I'm going to talk further about the open source festival that we had in February and how the success and how we had over 1,000 people visit us from various parts of Africa and the world. So these are clips, short images from various people across Africa in the meetups we've done to talk about open source in Africa. So this particular one is basically about, we also encourage designers also to get into open source, not just developers. We also encourage more women. As you can see from the images here, we have a lot more women in contributing to open source. So our community, the community here, open source community here in Africa is really diverse because we are encouraging every single person, irrespective of your gender, irrespective of whatever you do, as long as you can create, you are eager to learn about open source. We all encourage ourselves to get into open source. So OSCA project. So this is what the Open Source Community Africa has been up to. So the first thing I'll talk about is the Open Source Festival. So the Open Source Festival happened in February 2020, earlier this year, before the whole COVID-19 thing happened. It's basically going to be an annual open source gathering of OSS enthusiasts and contributors from all around Africa and other parts of the world. So we had folks from Google, we had folks from Github, we had folks from a couple of big organizations in Silicon Valley visit us. We had folks from Mapbox visit us here in Lagos, Nigeria, because it was hosted in Lagos, Nigeria, to come and talk about work they are doing in open source and how to get other people involved in open source. We saw about, it was a 3-day event, and we saw about over 1,000 people from different parts of Africa and also other parts of the world come to Africa to talk about open source. It was really a moment of glory for us here in Africa. It shows that the amount of people that are willing to get into open source here is very, very high. So, like I said, our community here in Africa is very, very diverse. So we encourage women to come into open source, women and young girls and girls in general to come into open source. So with Women of OSCA. So Women of OSCA, Open Source Community Africa, is a joint effort by She Code Africa. So She Code Africa is a non-governmental organization here in Nigeria and Africa generally that brings young girls and women into coding. So we did a joint effort with them to introduce and train more women into women and girls into open source generally. We saw an increase in the attendees for the attendance of women and girls grew by a very large number when we started the Women of OSCA, and we're looking forward to doing more and getting more women and girls into open source. So OSCA, and so while we're expanding, we're growing. We collaborated with open source, Open Collective Bounce to generate a bounce, create a bounty program. I mean, while open source is supposed to be free, I mean, there are some times where you need to actually encourage people by giving them certain incentives to do open source. So a collaboration with Open Collective, basically, we did it to introduce more people in open source by paying contributors to fix bugs on open source collective projects. So if you go to any open source collective specific projects and open source collective on their GitHub repo, you would see certain tags titled OSCA Bounty. So those bounty, when you finish, you send a PR to that, they would send you maybe $100, depending on the price of the particular open source particular issue. So we've seen a lot of growth from this because we see a lot of people like that eager to, a lot of students, a lot of young people that are eager to complete the bounty program, which I think is a growth, a incentive for growth here in the open source space in Africa. So the very important one I personally like is, I'm a developer, but I feel like designers are not really given the chance to show their works in open source. So here in Africa, like I said, our community here is diverse, so we were able to gather designers by starting the Open Source Design Africa. So it is done by the wonderful effort of the design team of Open Source Community Africa to help designers get with contributing to open source. So here, a lot of designers don't know how they will contribute to open source. A lot of designers don't know. So what we here is trying to change the narrative that just developers can change and can contribute to open source. So we have technical writers, and we also have open source designers here that try to get more designers into open source. And we've been seeing like a good number of designers that have contributed to open source. So connecting with Open Source Community Africa, so you can check the website www.oscafrica.org for more information. Also, you can also follow them on Twitter to see whatever we are doing here in Community Africa. And you can also donate to the cause on opencollective.com/Oscar. So that's basically it for Oscar. Now let's talk about key players in Africa's OSS ecosystem. The people I'm about to show you all now are people that have fought the fight basically for people to take open source development, open source contributions seriously in Africa here. We have a very good number of people. I will not be able to talk about every single person, but we have really, really great people here, and the amount of people here do not do justice to the number of people that we have here pushing the open source ideas in Africa. So the first person I would like to talk about is Samson. So Samson is a software developer who believes in changing the world. He's an open source advocate. He has been in open source space for about 9 to 10 years now. And currently he's maintaining Sugar Labs while also serving on the board of directors and sustaining open source collective as also a board member. He's the co-founder of the whole Open Source Community Africa, a movement that promotes and educates everything open source within Africa. He's currently consulting with the African Union. He's big on training, so he trains girls and trains young people on how to get started in technology with the United Nations and UN Women. You can find something on Twitter by something_body in case you have questions to talk about him. And he currently was featured on the Github README project, where he talked about his story and how he got into open source and the whole thing. So Samson has been in the open source movement for about 10 years, and he is a world recognized open source contributor and advocate. So the next person is Ada. So Ada Unduka Oyom, she's the founder of She Code Africa. Like I said, She Code Africa is a non-governmental organization that provides girls, women, opportunities to learn how to code and get into open source alongside. She's also the co-founder. She co-founded the Open Source Community Africa with Samson. They are great friends. And she plays an active role in building new communities, and integrating existing open source communities in the African ecosystem as well. She's also creating gender diversity, which is also very important. Like I said, our community is very, very diverse, and advocacy in OSS via the Women of Oscar, like I talked about earlier. So in February 2020, she and her team organized and hosted one also a program manager at Google. She's currently managing the Google Developer Group program here in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can find her on Twitter at Kolokodes, KOLOKODESS. And you can also always reach out and send her an invite on LinkedIn for more, to hear more from her. So this is Prosper Otemoyewa. He's an open source advocate, a well-known speaker around the world. He's been to various events across the world to talk about what we are doing here in Africa and also in PHP and JavaScript. He's an evangelist and is also currently the CTO of Eden Life Inc. He is one of the pioneers of the open source movement in Africa. Prosper fought the fight for people to get into open source here in Africa. He's a regular speaker, and in 2016, I think this is basically what he did in 2016 is basically what attracted most of the companies in Africa, in Silicon Valley here to Africa, companies like Netlify, GitHub, etc. In 2016, he beat out top companies like Facebook to trend number 2 on GitHub. I mean, a single person trending above companies with thousands of engineers, which is in the open source space, is a very big field here in Africa. The only company that was above him was Google in the list of training developers in the PHP section. So Prosper here has done a lot of advocacy for open source. He currently leads the Follow Up Africa, which brings people from different parts of Africa to talk about coding, etc. So Prosper here, you can find him on Twitter. It's always released on Twitter as Unicode Developer, and you can reach out, check out his GitHub profile. He has a lot of wonderful projects that people still use up to date. So let's talk about Abigail. Abigail is also a speaker. I think she spoke yesterday on open source design. So she spoke at All Things Open here on open source design. And she's a product designer and open source. She likes to call herself an open source design avocado. She has over 3 years experience of combined experience in technology, focusing on web and product design. Abigail is a big fan of open source. Personally, I've seen how passionate she is in getting people to grow as open source contributors. She's also a member of the Open Source Community Africa, and she was a Google Coding 2019 mentor for Anita B.org, a community that encourages the participation of all women involved in technology and open source. Abigail is a big fan of bringing women into open source, bringing women into design, open source design, into coding in general. So you can find her on Twitter at Abigail_Mark. Abigail is a very, very huge advocate of open source design. So Marlin is a Zimbabwean explorer. She's from Zimbabwe, and she's a speaker, and she loves cucumber. She's based in the city of Harare in Zimbabwe. She's an advocate for using science and technology for social good and increasing diversity in this field. Marlin has been in the open source space for a while, to the point where she's currently a director and a vice chair for the Python Software Foundation, which is one of the biggest foundations that is pushing open source code. And she's currently on the chair of the Python Africa, the Python Community Africa, that people that are involved using Python. She's currently on the chair. She's currently pursuing a computer science degree with the University of London. Marlin is a very big advocate for women in open source. She tries her best to get more people into open source. She tries her best to get more women to do STEM. You can follow her on Twitter at Marlin_ZW to hear more from her. Now, Shegun Adebayo. The funny thing about Shegun's story is Shegun did not really want to get into open source. If he was a designer before he even built Chakra UI. The Chakra UI is a popular React component library that helps you create accessible websites and apps by speed. I would like to say Shegun got into open source by accident. He built a very wonderful React component library and felt like he needed to share it. He was a user interface designer and an engineer before. He has the passion for design system accessibility and product design. He just felt like he needed to share to the world, and that was where Open Source Community Africa came in and saw what Shegun is doing, and we tried our best to push Shegun forward. And currently, the Chakra UI is one of the biggest open source projects that has come out of Africa, with about 11,000 stars. It has gotten praise from various developers across the world, even open source specialists across the world. Shegun is currently a design engineering manager at trading.com. He also co-founded Career Leap. Shegun currently is focusing his time on building Chakra UI. Chakra UI works for React, and currently there's a Vue version for Chakra UI, which shows how well open source would take a particular project and take someone's career up, especially here in Africa. So Chakra UI has been, Shegun has been a sort of inspiration for all developers here in Africa that are building open source products and building open source software. You can find him on Twitter at Shegun Adebayo, and you can connect with him to talk more about all things design systems and open source here in Africa. So, I mean, the number of people I spoke about do not just do justice to the amount of people here in Africa that are actually doing the open source work. So you can always reach out to me if you need a list of more people that are doing open source work. But I'm just trying to be careful of time so we don't exceed time. So notable OSS projects and communities from Africa. Like I said, Chakra UI is a wonderful React component library with about 11,000 stars. Image AI is in artificial intelligence image processing software. It's currently open source. and there's a link to it on this slide. So when you get the slide, you can open the link. It has about 5,000 stars on GitHub, and it was built here in Lagos, Nigeria, which is part of Africa. And Danfo.js is a visualization library that was made here in Nigeria. That's about 1,000 stars on GitHub, and we have seen people from various parts of the world give very good appreciation to it on how good and how it was able to save them from stress. So Made in Nigeria is a community of open source contributors here in Nigeria. It consists of a GitHub repo that has a list of most of the open source contributors we have here in Nigeria, various projects that have been built from Nigeria here. So you can always check out the GitHub repo. There are tons of over 1,000 amount of open source projects that have been created here in Nigeria. So Code for Africa encourages developers basically to learn how to code, encourages young people to learn how to code, including people that want to get into open source. They teach people how to contribute to open source projects and also learn how to code. Like I talked about the Open Source Community Africa, where we are driving, trying to get more people here to do open source. And the Material P09 team was created. I mean, most of us that use VS Code must have seen the Material P09 team. Well, Material P09 team was created here in Nigeria, in Africa to be specific, by Olaolo Olawuyi. This VS Code team has about 300,000 downloads and has gotten praises from various open source specialists and also designers across the world, from Sarah Jasna to Ken Sidod to Ahmed Awais that is maintaining WordPress. And the Free and Software and Open Source Foundation for Africa basically pushes open source and free software here in Nigeria. I mean, the Free and Open Source Software Foundation is mostly located in various parts of Africa, of the world, and this is basically the African branch, and it's headed by the UN. So now, I mean, we have very great open source contributors here in Africa, right? So how do we encourage them? How do we support open source software and open source contributors here in Africa? The first thing I would say is to sponsor more open source events here in Africa. When we held the Open Source Festival, we saw a lot of people a lot of companies, organizations that wanted that sponsored. We had Github, we had Microsoft, we had Github, we had Facebook, we had Genome, we had Sugar Labs. We had a lot of people that actually invested in getting us up and running. So we need more organizations to sponsor OSS events. So we need to also people to provide OSS learning support, and we need more resources on how people can get into open source here in Africa. I mean, resources are never enough. So we need more people to get resources, learning support for people here in Africa to learn how to contribute to open source. A lot of people don't know how to do that. Even though that's what we're trying to change here in Open Source Community Africa. Establish OSS initiatives. Also, we need more OSS initiatives. Currently, the only active community here in Africa is the Open Source Community Africa. We need more of these initiatives so that people can get into open source. So we need more. We need to be giving a voice for African developers, OSS creators and contributors. And we need more people. We need these people to feel like they're appreciated. So we need to provide more voices for them. For us generally, hire more folks from Africa. I mean, if you want to seek diversity and inclusion in open source, then open source companies should be willing to hire developers, designers, technical writers here in Africa. Promote OSS from Africa. So we need to companies, organizations, individuals should help preach the gospel of what is happening here in the open source space in Africa, like I'm doing. So get more folks to look into what is happening in Africa, get more folks to see what is happening in Africa, and would be happy. So with that, I would like to come to the end of my talk. It was exciting to creating these slides, give me more vision into where we've grown over the years in Africa. I thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this particular international track, and I wish to enjoy the remaining parts of All Things Open. I also want to thank the All Things Open organizers for giving me the opportunity to give this talk twice. It means a lot to me and everyone here in Africa. And you can follow me on Twitter at Koda_BLVCK. You can also send me a link or request on LinkedIn, and you can check out my blog where I post on all things software development on shady.xyz. Thank you so much once again for coming to my talk. And if you have any questions, you can just let me know, and I'll be willing to answer your questions. Thank you.